The following is a rebroadcast of the Front Row Arts Magazine program, originally aired at 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Good afternoon, I'm St. John Flynn. Thanks for joining us for an up-close look at the Houston area's diverse and vibrant art scene on the Front Row. Today is Labor Day, the annual holiday on which we honour the working men and women who built our nation and who continue to help it to thrive and prosper through their industriousness, inventiveness, intellectual fervour, the strength of their backs and the sweat of their brows. Our radio program is a daily celebration of the lives, endeavours and contributions to our culture of creative and performing artists here in Southeast Texas. On this special Labor Day edition of the show, we review a lifetime of work by a person who has been an integral member of Houston's arts community for 4 decades. At the end of July, Richard Nunamaker retired from his position as bass clarinetist and saxophonist with the Houston Symphony after 41 years with the orchestra. Today he tells us stories about the music directors under whom he served, and about some of the noteworthy concerts, tours, recordings, broadcasts, and community outreach and education projects in which he had the opportunity to participate during his years with the Houston Symphony. Richard Nunamaker, A Life in Music, today on the Front Row. Richard Nunamaker was born in Buffalo, New York. He showed an early interest in and talent for music, and by the time he was in high school, he was already managing his own dance bands. In the years since, he has pursued a varied career as a symphony musician, solo recitalist, recording artist, and producer, teacher, and author. He has commissioned over 50 new works for clarinet and saxophone and recorded a number of those pieces, and he has written and published 3 books on music. As you're about to hear, Mr. Nunamaker came to Houston in 1967 to audition for an open position in the Houston Symphony. He was immediately hired for the job by the orchestra's then-new music director, Andre Previn, and he has lived and worked here ever since. At the end of last month, Richard Nunamaker retired after 41 seasons with the orchestra. On this special Labor Day edition of the Front Row, he reminisces about his 4-decade-long career with the Houston Symphony in conversation with our producer Bob Stevenson, and we hear excerpts from his recordings and studio performances of some of the pieces with which he has been associated.
Well, Richard Nunamaker, if it's safe to say that your musical career with the Houston Symphony and elsewhere has been anything but orthodox, it started off in an unorthodox fashion. Just your coming to Houston and how you were hired to be a member of the symphony. It wasn't the sort of usual track.
No, it wasn't. Those are the days before we had behind-the-screen auditions and so forth. It was sort of the tail end of the days when you got a symphony job on the recommendation of your teacher.
Oh.
And conductors would call up famous teachers and say, I got a bass clarinet opening at such-and-so orchestra. Who do you have? Who's ready? And at that time, in 1967, I had just finished 2 years with the Louisville Orchestra in graduate school in Louisville, and I was teaching school in Indiana and studying and playing with Chicago Civic. And that was the year 1967. That was the famous Chicago blizzard where the city was shut down for 2 weeks. I mean, everything was snowed in. In the middle of that, while we were all trying to get back to work, get the city open, I get a call from a fellow in Chicago. He said he had just talked with my teacher, Jerry Stoll, and wanted to know if I would be interested in auditioning for the Houston Symphony. And it would be a preliminary audition at his apartment in Chicago the next day on clarinet, bass clarinet, and E-flat clarinet. So I loaded my stuff, navigated my way through as best I could these huge snowdrifts and snow banks in Chicago, played the audition. He liked what I did, and he says, great, I'll recommend you go down to Houston and play for Andre Previn. It's going to be Previn's first year as music director. So a couple of weeks later, I fly down carrying all my instruments and went down to Jones Hall. It's the second year that Jones Hall was open. Went downstairs to the rehearsal room for my audition, and there was Andre Previn with 3 or 4 people from the wind section. Previn says, "Nice to meet you. Want to smoke?" Well, sure. No, we smoked a cigarette, talked a little bit, and he said, "Well, let me hear the Mozart." So I played the Mozart concerto for him. "Oh, I like that. Want to smoke?" "Sure." Played another excerpt. "How about some coffee?" And this went on for about 3.5 hours. We talked a little bit, played a little bit, chatted. We got through, and he offered me the job on one condition. He said, "The job is yours," but he said, "Please, get rid of that piece of junk bass clarinet and buy yourself a decent instrument." I said, "Done deal."
So that's how it started in 1967. A one-shot, continuous audition, and you're hired.
And I was hired.
Okay, so Andre Previn was here for 2 seasons.
He was
right?
here for 2 years.
Okay, and so it was under him that your Houston Symphony career began.
I guess the most amazing thing about how the whole thing started, I mean, the audition was quite unusual, but the first piece that I ever played with the Houston Symphony was the William Schumann Third Symphony, which has this huge virtuosic bass clarinet solo in the scherzo movement. It's a duet with bass clarinet and snare drum. I mean, it's one of the big solos of the bass clarinet repertoire. That was my beginning concert. That was the first piece I played.
Oh, my goodness.
And we did that piece also in the spring in Carnegie Hall. And after that concert, Andre called me in, and he liked what I did and gave me tenure about 6 months early. And he says, "You're free. You may now talk back to me." And that was the beginning.
Sounds like you and Andre hit it off quite well.
We had a good time.
How was he as a conductor?
Actually, he was very interesting. When he came here, he was just really getting his feet wet. He had a lot of experience. He was a wonderful musician. And he had had a lot of experience working in the studios. But he was a quick study. And I think one of the most valuable experiences I had with Andre was Gershwin. He used to do the Rhapsody in Blue, the Concerto in F, and American in Paris with us. And he really taught this orchestra how to play Gershwin. And Previn's mantra was, if you play exactly what Gershwin put on the page and don't dress it up, it works. And he was right. It did.
This was an era, and I know he suffered from this a bit, and you may have too over the course of your career, when there was a great deal of suspicion amongst the classical music cognoscenti regarding musicians who ventured into other areas. And of course,
yes.
Previn had this simultaneous classical and jazz careers going on, which is what gave him insight into Gershwin, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
But I know he also wasn't taken seriously when he really got into conducting orchestras and classical music because of his jazz background.
Well, the jazz background and the studio background, although the studio background really gave him the chops. He knew how orchestras worked, and he understood orchestration, and he understood balancing an orchestra to get the right kind of a sound out of an orchestra. Andre ran into problems dealing with a room full of 85 or 90 thoroughbred horses with the appropriate egos. It was very difficult sometimes. But probably one of the funniest stories I can tell is was we were rehearsing Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony. It was my first year in the orchestra. I was still kind of green. But the first rehearsal, I'll never forget, he started the second movement. It opens up with this tremendously difficult fugue in the second violins. It's one of those things that violin players, especially second violin players, just wait for. And he gave a downbeat. It was a train wreck. It was really awful. And Andre had this habit. He would stop and put the baton down, and he would sit there, and he was like that El Cap character. This big black cloud would sort of come over his head. What seemed like a half an hour was probably 2 minutes went by, and then he looked over at the principal second violin player, and he said, "George, that sounds like blankety blank blank blank." And I said there was this big gasp in the orchestra.
So he could talk back to the orchestra, too.
You couldn't talk back with him.
Sounds like you had a bit more success with a different Rachmaninoff piece, that being the Third Symphony, which the orchestra also played in Carnegie Hall in New York City with Previn.
Right. The following year, we did that in Carnegie Hall, and that was a standing ovation. It was really a marvelous performance. Previn had a real knack. He probably still does. He had a real knack for doing the music of Rachmaninoff.
I think he recorded most of it for RCA.
Oh, yes, right. But one of my favorite stories, Previn had a wonderful sense of humor. It was really quite dry if you weren't on the wrong side of it. But that was my third or fourth week with the orchestra. We were doing a cello concerto by Miklos Roza that was written, it was commissioned by the orchestra, and it was written for our principal cellist, Shirley Truppel. And the slow movement ended with this beautiful bass clarinet solo. It just sort of started in the bottom part of the horn and just sort of drifted up, climbed up an octave or two, and just sort of ended on a high note. I think it was a concert F, and just sort of melted in just a wisp of air. A wonderful solo. So opening night, I'm playing the solo, and it's going great, and I drift up, and I just get on that, just hit that concert F, and a huge squeak comes out of the horn. It's only a bass clarinet can do, and I was mortified, and Previn just kept a straight face. He called me into the office after the performance. He said, "Don't worry about it." He says, "That happens to everybody." He says, "I just want you to know that," he says, "as long as Jones Hall is standing, that squeak will live in the rafters." He says, "Just don't squeak tomorrow night."
So it's still up there.
It's
floating
still there,
around somewhere.
bouncing around. The last concert I did, I saw it. We sort of waved at each other as I left the stage.
After Previn, Lawrence Foster came in.
He came in to really build the orchestra. And under Larry, we beefed up the wind section. That's when we added 4 players, a 4th player in each section, assistant principals. He added, I believe, 3 stands of violins and a stand of basses during his 7 years with us.
Wow.
But Larry had a wonderful sense of humor. I can tell a funny story. It was the first or second year he brought in Vladimir Ashkenazy to do Schumann piano concerto. And Larry had a habit in those days of, he thought that Stokowski did this. He thought this was really nice, to walk out, acknowledge the audience, and as he turned around on the podium, bang, give a downbeat. And
all in kind of one
all
fluid
in one motion,
Yes,
bang.
okay.
You know, that's always dicey to do that.
Yeah.
And then we asked him, Larry, that's kind of chancy. Sometimes it's just, can you just wait? Well, I kind of like that. Well, came in with Ashkenazy, and of course the Schumann opens up with the piano solo.
Oh,
bang.
It's got that wonderful sort of double chord at the beginning, yes.
So he turns around, they both take a bow, Larry turns around, bam, gives a downbeat. Ashkenazy's buns weren't even on the bench yet. So it's clunk, 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 clunk. And then we get going. And then during the...
So he started playing the concerto sort of...
Oh, yeah, on the way down. On the way down. So then all during the first movement, Ashkenazy's kind of sniffing. And he gets out his handkerchief when he can. He's wiping his brow, and all these facial contortions are going on. And Larry's getting kind of nervous, and we're playing, and we're like, what's going on? So we get through with the first movement. Ashkenazy drops his arms, and he just sort of goes, out comes the handkerchief. So Larry turns around, he says, "Are you okay?" And Ashkenazy, "I don't know." He said, "Come here," and he wiggles his finger for Larry to get down off the podium.
And to come over where he is.
To come over to where he is. So Larry's off the podium, and just as he leans down to see what's going on, Ashkenazi starts the second movement. Bump, 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 bump.
Touche.
It was great. So Larry never did that routine again. He always came out, gave the orchestra time to get collected before a downbeat.
You mentioned Andre Previn's sense of humor. What about Larry Foster?
We used to play. I played several concertos with Larry, and there was always some sort of funny business going on between he and I on stage just before the downbeat to the performance, or sometimes between movements. He always had a joke or something funny to say.
You recorded some concertos by contemporary composers during this period, right?
Larry asked me, I guess it was the end of his second year that he was here, if I'd be interested in doing the Ingolf Dahl saxophone concerto for saxophone and wind ensemble. And we did that the following season. That was a lot of fun. Larry and I also traveled. In those days, the Houston Symphony used to do a lot of state touring, and we did one tour, and I was a soloist. We did the Villalobos Fantasia for soprano saxophone and orchestra. That was a lot of fun. And then the following year, 2 years later, Larry asked me if I'd be interested in doing the Pierre Max Dubois concerto for saxophone and orchestra. That one I did with Jorge Mester. I conducted that.
A portion of the finale of the saxophone concerto by contemporary French composer Pierre-Max Dubois, performed in concert by soloist Richard Nunemaker. This special Labor Day edition of our programme is a retrospective of Mr. Nunemaker's 41-year career as bass clarinetist and saxophonist with the Houston Symphony, a position from which he retired at the end of the orchestra's recently concluded summer season. After a break, Richard Nunemaker shares stories from the years he played in the Houston Symphony under music directors Sergio Commissiona and Christoph Eschenbach.